Hi everyone, welcome back to the 21 and Sensory podcast with me, Emily. On today's show, I have the lovely Esme Jay, who is also known by the nickname Pixie. Esme is a queer autistic writer turned content creator living with PTSD and anxiety. They run at Pixie's Big Y over on Instagram, which has almost 18,000 followers. Esme shares their life, including content around lifestyle, fashion, autism, mental health, and chronic illness. So, Esme, would you like to say hello?
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me on.
No worries. I'm really glad we were able to find a time to chat. Um, yeah, I've been following you on Instagram for a while, and I was just like, oh, I'm gonna see if Esme's up for coming on the podcast, and you were. So, thank you.
Thank you. It's such an honor.
Oh, when people say that, I'm just like, oh, people know my podcast or know of it. Um, so let's just jump straight into it. Maybe we could start by discussing any diagnoses you have. Obviously, I've said that you are autistic and that you struggle with PTSD and anxiety. So maybe you could let us know a little bit more about those.
Sure. I was diagnosed with autism when I was 18, which is considerably late for someone with the support needs I have. I needed full-time care from when I was born, and I was quite obviously developmentally disabled. But sadly, I grew up in an abusive home, which meant that my access to proper care was both limited and weaponized as abuse. My dad would say that everything I did was either a sign of being bad, whatever that means, or a
Mhm.
sign that I was simply mentally ill, which he seemed to get a lot of gratification from. Neither were true, but that meant I didn't get diagnosed with autism as early as I should have. I received a generalized anxiety diagnosis at 2, followed by a social anxiety and OCD diagnosis in my teens. One of my psychiatrists was extremely questionable in his practices, and he refused to assess me for autism at all, despite my pediatrician and speech and language therapist basically insisting that he did. His behavior, along with my dad's participation, probably wouldn't happen now. He would admit to manipulating me and even told me that the goal was to distress me. The whole process was so traumatic that I developed an eating disorder the following year, which I'm still trying to recover from 10 years later. Autism was floated as a likely diagnosis since I was around 2, especially since I could neither attend school nor complete basic tasks without help. I had full-time care growing up, but only my mum recognized that I was disabled. Everyone else just thought I was clingy, spoiled, and extremely bad, partly because my dad spread a lot of rumors about me. I disowned my dad in the February of 2016, and surprise, surprise, was diagnosed with autism less than 6 months later, aged 18. It wasn't questioned at all by the psychologist who diagnosed me. He was very surprised I wasn't already diagnosed. I also have PTSD, which we found out a while later when I was living in Paris after escaping abuse. I think that my diagnostic experience is quite unusual, especially because when people hear that you're diagnosed later, they kind of assume that it must have been because you were masking or because you just weren't as high in terms of needs. But
Mhm.
for me, it was mostly because I was abused, which I think is something that we need to talk about more as a community, because abuse does prevent us from accessing healthy and adequate care.
Thank you so much. You put that so succinctly. That was really helpful. I mean, it sounds like you had a hell of a lot going on as you were growing up, um, and also the fact that you were diagnosed with anxiety age 2. You
Yeah.
already had that kind of you know general anxiety about life at such a young age, and then to not be put forward for an autism assessment until much later in life must be like really frustrating, alongside you know everything else that's going on in your life.
Definitely. I mean, I think what I always found so honestly questionable as a practice was that they diagnosed me with anxiety without even meeting me. Um, I
Okay.
sat in the corner drawing a picture, and I didn't speak. I didn't have any kind of contact with them whatsoever. And they just diagnosed me. My mum was like, "Well, have you thought about autism?" And they were like, "Oh, yeah, yeah, no, no, definitely not." And they didn't know anything about me. They hadn't tested me. They hadn't looked into it. They knew nothing. And I think that they diagnosed me with anxiety because autism was not seen as a thing for AFAB people or women or girls. It just wasn't back then. It was like, oh, it's only boys. It's only like cis boys, and that's it.
Mhm.
Which we now know is completely wrong. But back then, that was the narrative. And I think that combined with my dad's incredible levels of manipulation and insistence on a certain agenda, it was impossible for me to have proper care. And so I grew up feeling like I knew something was more than just anxiety,
Mhm.
but I wasn't able to access anything that could help me. It was just me and my mum kind of fighting against the
And
battle that we felt.
yeah. And also, like, your mum being like, "What about autism?" And them just, like, shutting that down. Like, she obviously had,
Yeah,
a bit of an inkling going on that, potentially she saw.
yeah. I mean, I had a very, I would say, quite stereotyped presentation. And so I'm not entirely sure why they didn't think it. I think it was mostly my dad's meddling that kind of got them to think a different thing because he's a very intelligent guy. He's got a degree in psychology. He's very manipulative. Um, and I think that he was able to kind of shift their perspective with just a few sentences. He's always been very good at that.
Mhm.
And he didn't want me to be autistic because that would have meant that I needed more care, and if I needed more care, then it would take the spotlight off him. And so I think that he wanted me to have anxiety so that he could push me down, and I think that diagnosis was a dream come true for him.
You talk about it so well and kind of coming to terms with this as an adult, but as a child, did you really know what was going on? Did you It must have been so overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I look back at my childhood, I can see like a dichotomy between absolute heaven and complete hell. It was either blissful because I spent most of my time in my imagination and my
Mhm.
mum really nurtured my creative side. I was always a writer from as young as I remember. I don't remember a time when I wasn't writing. And I think that was my escape. I lived in my head and I daydreamed a lot, really immersive stuff. And I think that gave me this ability to step outside what was happening. And I guess it was a kind of controlled um, disassociation of kinds. And then when I came back into myself and into my life, I'd realized I just couldn't cope with it. The abuse I experienced from a young age was quite traumatic, obviously, but then I think the fact that it crossed over into my medical needs and the kind of help I was able to get really messed me up because it's so hard to live when you know there's something going on and you're just told that you're a bad person when you're like 2 years old. That can really mess up the way your brain develops. And technically, studies have shown that people who experience psychological abuse when their brain is developing can form, I believe, neurological connections based on abuse. So abuse becomes their default state to be a victim. And I don't say that in a derogatory way at all. It's a sad thing. And I think it can take a lifetime to rewire the brain to accept better things.
Mhm. And I guess as a child, if you don't know any different, then that is what you think the world is like. That's how you think people operate, which is really sad to hear that, you're having to unpick this all like as you get older. And I was going to ask you, so I know you were diagnosed when you were 18. So that was in
Yeah.
2016, I think, for you. What
Yeah.
were you kind of I can only imagine you would have been in sort of like major burnout by that point, or what led you at that age to a diagnosis?
Well, my dad got arrested for various things in February of 2016. And after that, within days, I went to my doctor, and that was for something unrelated. But they were like, So, have you got an autism diagnosis? And I hadn't even mentioned that I thought I was autistic or anything.
Oh.
I didn't think it was relevant. I'd just given up by that point,
Mhm.
honestly. And they thought I was already diagnosed because I think they could just tell. And I said, No, I haven't been diagnosed." And they were very shocked by that. They thought that I'd been diagnosed as a toddler because it was always kind of talked about by any medical professionals I saw. And I guess that the doctor must have just thought that it was a diagnosis. Um, and I had to say, No, I actually haven't been. And they referred me. And I think it was the following July, or the same July coming of 2016, that I went to see um, the psychology team, and I saw, I think, 3 people over the course of about 2 weeks, and I think each meeting was about 5 hours long. It was quite intense, and they diagnosed me right off the bat. They didn't really there was no kind of wondering or questioning. They were just like, "Yes, it's obvious," after all of those meetings. And I think because at the time I was trying to escape my dad because he'd been hospitalized, and I didn't once he came out of hospital, I was in this kind of race against time to get away. And I didn't even really think about my diagnosis. It was kind of the least important thing in my life. And I think that's one of the reasons I started creating content so much later on, because I just hadn't even considered it. And when we moved to Paris as a way to escape, that was when I realized I couldn't live alone. I couldn't have that so-called neurotypical life because I am disabled, and I've been trying so hard not to be for so many years. And even though when I look back at my childhood and my life, I had basically 24-hour care, I
Mhm.
didn't want to admit that I needed it. And so I tried to not need those things. And
Mhm.
that was when the burnout happened, I think a few years later in Paris.
I think I read somewhere that you started your kind of online presence in 2019. Was that around the same time or?
That was, I'd say, about a year later. I had a kind of nervous breakdown, which I think was a combination of trauma and burnout and all kinds of things
Mhm.
in 2017, and that lasted up to mid 18. And then in 2019, I was actually homeless at the time, and I was living in poverty, and I was squatting in an apartment in Paris near the Eiffel Tower.
Mhm.
And I think that I started posting about my life after trauma and surviving an abusive household in 2019, and as well as talking about the kind of immediate parts of my life, the poverty and the homelessness. I also spoke about the realities of being autistic and needing quite a lot of daily support. Most of the creators in the autistic community seem to have lower support needs, and I felt very isolated by that. Their voices often speak over people with higher needs, so I tried to tell my story in a way that felt more inclusive. My goal was always to make people feel less alone, and it was amazing to see the community grow during that first part of the pandemic when a lot of people felt lonely. At that time, Pixie's Big Why was both the reason and the purpose that I did survive, because I had to start a GoFundMe to try to escape homelessness. Because as a disabled person, I wasn't able to get a job, and my mum was my full time carer, so she didn't have the ability to work either.
Mhm.
And I wouldn't be here today if those people, these strangers who I didn't even know, hadn't come forward and helped me. Thanks to them, I'm still alive. And so Pixie's Big Why is something I owe my life to. And I'm incredibly grateful to have that community, and especially to look back and realize how far I've come and that I might be able to eventually give something back.
That's amazing. Like, just to hear the kind of process and kind of how it started to where you are now. And am I right in thinking that your mum actually like came up with the name Pixie's Big Why?
Yeah, she did. I didn't know what to call it, and I called it like some random kind of placeholder name. I can't even remember. It was terrible. And then he was like, "Why don't you call it Pixie's Big Why?" Because I had this mood board that I it was just like a little scrapbook, and it was reasons to keep going, reasons for living, and I
Mhm.
called it Pixie big Y, and I never even thought about calling my Instagram that, and then she was like, "Why don't you just call it that?" And it's been that ever since.
Amazing. I love that your mum made that connection and you were just like, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense." That's so
Once I
cool.
heard it, that was it. It was like, I'm not calling it anything else.
I think that's great. I think, you know, it kind of hints at the fact that, there's so much going on and you're just trying to live your life and unpick all the things that have happened to you. And I think I read somewhere as well. Did you say that you were studying while you were in Paris? Was that what you were doing
Yeah, I
alongside?
went I went to a language school for 6 months to study French,
Oh, okay.
and that was really interesting because I think that being autistic meant that I couldn't handle traditional studies. I have always wanted to go to law school, and I still plan to one day. I have this dream that when I'm 50, I'm going to become a lawyer, and I might become either a human rights lawyer or a criminal lawyer, but I may never do any of those things. But I knew that I wouldn't be able to handle traditional studies. So this language school was amazing because it was one on one. And I just sat in a room with my teacher, who I had a real connection with. We were great friends and talked about French and talked in French. And that was really amazing because that was the only form of education outside of, well, what my mum has given me because I was homeschooled after I wasn't able to cope with school as a kid. And there was only really 2 options when I was young. There was mainstream education, and then there was no education. And
Mm.
since I could, survive with the former, my mum, who was a teacher at one point, taught me from home, and I think that was the only form of education I was able to cope with. And so going to language school years later was amazing because it felt like I could still learn something, but in a way that was adaptive because it was so intimate and quiet. There was no kind of stress of like
Mm.
campuses or college life or anything like that. It was just very calm, and it was only for, I think, 4 hours a day, twice a week. So I was able to cope with that.
Mhm. That sounds like it sounds way more like suited to you as an individual rather than just like, like how a classroom usually is kind of thing, like having it one to one and really being able to get the teacher's time. That's the thing. You never get the teacher's time.
Yeah, it's true. I think that was amazing for me, and also having a teacher who was so wonderful, and she was just such an amazing person and really fun. And I'm of Indian descent, and her husband was Indian, so we used to talk about that, and that was really interesting because there was like this connection, and that was fantastic.
That's really lovely as well. Like just to have that connection, and especially if you're learning a language as well, like you want you want to be getting on with the person, obviously, because then I don't know. I guess conversation comes a bit more naturally that way.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes more like a friendship rather than something you're trying to force just because you're paid to be there.
Yeah, definitely. Um, so when did you kind of in terms of a timeline that I feel like we're trying to sort of paint here, when did you move back to the UK? Because you live in Wales now, is that right?
I do, yeah. So I grew up in Bristol and I lived there until I was 18. And then I fled to Paris and I lived there until 2020. So from 2017 to 2020. And then once we'd raised enough money through the GoFundMe, we were able to move back to the UK. And we initially ended up in like West Wales in this really rural place, and we kind of floated from place to place, eventually ending up in Cardiff towards the end of 2020. And we were still unhoused legally. We didn't have any proper housing, and I documented that for a long time on my Instagram. Um, and then eventually in late 2020, around December, we ended up moving to, again, a very rural place. And having grown up in a major city, I'm not able to cope with rural life very well. And I think that's when I started to kind of face what I'd been through. I was forced to face it because I was so isolated. And in 2022, I realized I couldn't cope with life anymore. And so I just deleted my Instagram and I was away for a whole year. And then I came back last year, and that was kind of when we were focusing on moving from this super rural place. And we now live in Cardiff, and life is so much better for me to be around people and around a more busy environment. Even though I'm very reclusive, I love to be in the middle of things. I find it incredibly stimulating.
Mhm. I can understand that. I know like a lot of people like in terms of kind of like city living, I'm like, oh, I just want to live in a rural place in the middle of nowhere, like live in the sticks kind of thing. But actually, I don't know, like hearing other people around you and knowing, how far away like the shops are or something like that, like knowing that there's people or there's help like around the corner. I think I would kind of prefer that rather than just like living out without any neighbors and, just in the middle of nowhere. So I do definitely understand. Like I feel like some people be like, "Oh, but rural living is sounds so cool." But
Yeah,
especially if
I've
all these
done it.
thoughts were coming back to you as well.
Yeah. And I think just the fact that I couldn't do anything because we were like an hour away from the nearest city. And that is just so isolating because everybody who's ever lived there has always lived there. There's no real
Yeah.
newcomers. We were always these kind of different ones, these city slickers. And then when we moved back to Cardiff, well, not back to Cardiff, but we moved to Cardiff, I just felt like I could finally spread my wings a bit and actually have a life that wasn't just hiding from the world. It was actually going out into the world and finding what it had to offer.
Mhm. And like I can see that kind of happiness through your content. Like I think there was a video I watched on your Instagram and you were like cycling like through I don't know if it was through Cardiff or not, but it just looked quite like, you were able to be independent in that moment and just have that time to yourself.
Yeah, definitely. That was around Cardiff Bay, which is just such a cool place. It's so stunning for cycling. It's just amazing.
That's good, especially because like I feel like a lot of cities people are like, "Oh, I would never cycle." Like they're
Oh
too
my
like
God.
busy.
I think I find cycling easier than walking. I learned to ride a bike at 7, and both my parents were or are cyclists. So I was kind of able to learn in a way that I wasn't able to learn anything else. Like I can't swim, I can't really do that much, but I can ride a bike. And so
Mhm.
cycling has been a huge part of my life. I always cycled in Bristol. I would train around the harbour, and I was a road cyclist for a long time. I was really dedicated. I'd go out every morning at 6 a.m. And then in
Wow.
Paris too, I was always riding a bike. That's how I got everywhere. And yet I couldn't do that when I lived rurally because we were in the mountains, and because of my health, I'm not really able to cycle up hills. So that was really tough, and I just didn't have the ability to ride a bike. Yeah, as soon as we got back to the city, it was like, I'm gonna ride a bike again.
That's nice that it kinda, like, came back to you. It's something, like, you never forget, isn't it? Like, just how to ride a bike and this that sense of, like, freedom as well. Like, especially, like, as a kid, like, it's the fastest you can go under your own, like, steam, isn't it? Like, cycling.
Yeah, it's true. And also the freedom, I think, for me is I can put my troubles behind me. I have this expression that I came up with years ago, and it was put your troubles under the pedals. So when I'm riding my bike, I like stamp down on my problems and on my worries, and I just let them fly beneath me. And I
Mhm.
don't allow them to follow me. They have to stay behind. And then when I get off my bike, I can regroup and focus on what I need to focus on and maybe sort out whatever I'm worrying about. But when I'm on my bike, I don't worry.
Mhm. I guess if your mind is, focused on the kind of cycling and the getting to where you need to be kind of thing, like, I can understand that actually you can't there isn't much room to think anything else.
It's true. You're just like, you have to be in the moment, especially
Mhm.
if you're in the city, because you could just get run over by a bus. You have to keep your
Yeah.
wits about you.
There is danger everywhere. At
Yeah.
least that, like, that keeps you aware. I
It
guess that's a good
definitely
thing.
does.
And coming back to kind of your content and your Instagram, I know that you kind of, I think I mentioned earlier, like the kind of range of things that you discussed, but I remember specifically reading an Instagram post about you identifying as gender fluid and asexual. And
Yeah.
yeah, it really resonated with me. And you put it just so clearly and mentioned how like your identities come together and intertwine. So it'd be really interesting to know kind of more of that side of things as well.
Sure. I found out I was asexual around 15, but I think most people always suspected I was queer. I'm very sapphic. I love women a lot, but I don't like dating. I love my own company. And
Mhm,
sex is kind of neutral to me, but I find myself sex repulsed when the time comes. I can't explain it. I'm kind of theoretically sex positive, and I think it's amazing that people can find empowerment in sex. But I find it kind of discomforting. Is that the word? Discomforting?
mhm,
Like someone pushing my boundaries. And I think that may be an asexual thing, but I think it has more to do with autism than you'd imagine because of the sensory side of things, the kind of communication difficulties you may have that
mhm,
can kind of make sex for me anyway. I know there's many autistic people who love sex, but for me, it's like, what am I doing? Like, what am I
mhm,
doing here in this moment? And I think that can make me quite repulsed by it personally. But with women, I guess it's slightly different. But with men, I'm quite afraid of them. And I think that that plays into how being autistic, I'm very tuned into what I've been through. And I think that that has kind of intertwined with how I see myself sexually because having had many experiences that are quite untoward, but I kind of find myself pushing boundaries in how I see sex and gender. So I think sometimes I think people intertwine gender and sexuality too much because how I see myself sexually is so different to how I see myself in terms of gender. So I'm quite afraid of getting close to people intimately because of the sensory side of things and just because I am ace and I think that can just make me much more distanced. But
mhm,
then in terms of gender, I feel like it's something I want to dive into as much as possible. So, like, I don't define it. I feel like gender is something that I swim around in. It's like an ocean with as many different shades of color and light and texture as you can find. It's so infinite. And I love playing with the possibilities of how that feels. And I do think that being ace, people assume that I'm gonna have a really closed mind. I think that's the kind of assumption that if you're ace, you're like prudish or you're repressed. And I hate that
mhm.
assumption because for me, it's more of a personal thing, like sensory and all that stuff. And then with my gender, it just opens up like a flower, which is why, even though they are intertwined, they're kind of not at the same time. And I think that for me, being that I look very femme, I have a lot of privilege, but people at the same time don't realize how queer I am and how proud I am to be queer and how proud I am to be gender fluid. I could never spend a lifetime living in one gender. I feel like I belong to a spectrum of all of them. And
Mhm.
so I love being queer. I love being sapphic and loving women and I love knowing who I am. I've never had a lot of doubt. I think there's a lot of doubt for a lot of people, but for me, there just hasn't been. I just have always known who I am.
That's amazing. That's the way you put that was so, I don't know, it just sounds like you know who you are and the way you like described kind of like how like gender fluid kind of, it's like kind of being kind of in a sea, kind of swimming sort of thing. Like
Yeah.
that literally just said the word like fluid to me in my head. Like I really, really like saw that. And also, it's really interesting what you're saying about like the kind of sensory stuff and the kind of asexual stuff as well, because there sounds like there really is like so much of an overlap.
It's all of the senses. It's every single one. And I think people don't see that. Like I've had people say to me, oh, it doesn't have to be that sensory. Have you tried sensory deprivation and things like that? And I thought, but there's too much of even just one.
Mm.
It's like
Yeah.
there's always going to be that huge amount of sensory input. And also, I think emotionally, I feel like I'm being peeled back and someone's like trying to scoop me out like a banana or like an avocado.
Mhm.
And to me, it's like I need there to be a distance between myself and somebody else. And sometimes I wonder how much of that is being ace and how much of it's being autistic. And maybe they meet in the middle and maybe they overlap, but
Mhm.
they definitely both feature for me very strongly.
So you were mentioning about the kind of sort of stigma around being ace, and I think
Mhm.
it's kind of interesting because I feel like we're slowly beginning to see more kind of media representation of asexual people, which is great.
Yeah.
But there is still this stigma of like, why don't you want to have sex? I think even just like from what you've been saying, like when you hear someone describe, how sensory it is and how kind of all consuming it is sensory wise, like I feel like people just need to be open to the idea that it's not a straightforward thing, like especially as an autistic person, like it's a hell of a lot of information to process.
It really is, especially because I think there's this idea that sex is all about just orgasms, but actually, there's so much more involved. And I think that people underestimate that because that may not be as important to them. And that's not in any way a bad thing. But if you are autistic, I think it's like you don't exactly know how much sensory input there's going to be at any given moment because sometimes things can surprise you from a sensory perspective, not even just sexually but just in life. You go outside and it's surprisingly windy one day and it's like, oh my god. And I think the same happens with sex, and that definitely plays into asexuality, I think, because we underestimate how much sensory input there is, but also how much emotional input, because asexuality is really about sexual attraction, not enjoying sex. There are many asexual people who absolutely love sex, and then there are some that are either neutral about it or just don't enjoy it. And I would say I was like between neutral and not enjoying. I think it's very um, I don't know, it's so specific, and because I don't really know how it's gonna be in the moment, I tend to just think this is pointless, and so
Hmm.
I just don't really bother. But I think that if you are kind of living as an asexual person, you're so used to people telling you that, like, the sensory elements aren't important, or just in general, it's not seen as something that we should kind of be. We shouldn't be asexual, we should be incredibly sexual, and I think you can be both. It's like I absolutely love creating like lingerie related content and boudoir photo shoots and things like that. And people are like, but I thought you were asexual. It's like you still can be. It really has nothing to do with that. There's an amazing content creator, but I've forgotten her name, but she is
Is it
very as
Yasmin? I feel like I'm
yes,
sure of her. Yes.
Yasmin Benoit, yeah.
I remember seeing like her posts and people being like, well, you can't be because like she's also very into kind of her photo shoots and things. And I'm just like,
Yeah.
well, she is. Like,
I know. And I think it's like you can enjoy the aesthetic of like sexual content and sexuality and exploring how different lingerie and different looks kind of play out in your life, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily experience sexual attraction. And I think that is the thing that we don't talk about it enough in life. We don't know about it. It's something that we just haven't discussed in the mainstream.
mhm. No, exactly. And I kind of feel like I think earlier you were saying like how like dating isn't your thing. And I'm just like, I can definitely like relate to that because again, it's especially as an autistic person, like it starts from the very beginning of trying to get to know someone is like, oh, should I tell them this about myself? Should I tell them that about myself? And then the whole kind of social aspect, like It's all kind of hellish, really.
It really is. And I think unmasking is so hard. I
Mm,
have a friend, and they're so amazing because they just decided to start being completely honest on their dating profiles and like when they talk to people. And they were so worried they were going to put this guy off. And he was actually very receptive to their honesty. And I think that honesty is so refreshing because we don't see that a lot. We're so used to putting on this show for people so that they
mhm.
like us. And I know that I do that all the time. I have no idea how to be genuine because I'm so anxious and I'm so awkward most of the time. So I think it's really refreshing when people can just be themselves. And I think that takes so much courage.
Yeah, I think you have to be really brave to just be like, right, I'm going for it. Like, I'm just gonna be me. But also, it just means that, like, you're right. Like, you don't have to just mask your way through a relationship. You can just be yourself, which is really important.
Definitely. And I think it's rare too. It's
Yeah.
incredible, real feat to just be yourself.
Hmm. Maybe we could chat also a little bit more about the other sort of content that you like to share on Instagram, which is kind of around sort of writing and creativity. And I know that you have a love of fashion as well. Um, so maybe you could kind of let us know who your influences are. I know that you're a big Audrey Hepburn fan. um,
Definitely.
yeah, but maybe, yeah, also you could maybe provide some advice on if listeners are struggling to find their own style. I struggle. So any advice is great.
Sure. But creating fashion content for me is like a dream hobby. I need a lot of support doing it, so I only usually make one or two fashion reels a month. But I really love the creativity part because I've always been in love with style, particularly vintage style. I would watch the old adaptations of Sherlock Holmes and like Poirot, and I'd spend hours memorizing the costumes and noting how pieces were paired together. I had coffee outfits I saw in movies as a form of self-soothing. I didn't have very much confidence as a kid. I was bullied a lot about my looks, and I think this sent me into my tiny world where I wanted to create a style that felt safe and whimsical.
Mhm,
When I fled to Paris, I cut my hair into a bob and I found myself in a whole new way. My style was really born on the streets of Paris. And today, I spend a lot of time studying color analysis, which is a way of using color theory to see what colors suit our unique features. Some people find this limiting, but I find it really helpful. I use the 12 season method, so I'm a deep summer, which means I look best in colors that are cool toned and slightly muted. A lot of people find that whole system very irritating, but it's one of my special interests.
mhm,
I think I think a lot of people struggle to find their personal style because there are so many rules attached to fashion. We witness these vast amounts of overconsumption and trends that disappear after a few weeks, and people lose their confidence. I like making style into a story. How do you want to be perceived? What makes you happy? Who do you want to be? I think that can be a great way to find style inspiration. You can look to movie characters, celebrities, or even book characters to see what they wear and why their style works for them. O Obviously, as we said, my ultimate style icon is Audrey Hepburn, and I think this is because her style managed to be both androgynous and whimsical, while also being incredibly timeless and wearable. I think it's important to find someone you vibe with and use elements of their style to build your own and have fun. Like, don't take it too seriously. I think a lot of people take it seriously, and I definitely did for many years, but at the end of the day, it's just clothes. It's all a bit silly.
yeah, because I kind of feel like that. Like I feel like I almost like my clothing is part of my mask, if that makes sense. So I
Yeah.
try not to stick out, and like I'll kind of wear quite like dark or kind of like monotone kind of combinations of colors. But
Yeah.
actually, if I was to maybe explore a little bit more, I might, quite like bright colors, but I just kind of I don't want to stand out. And
Yeah, I
that's really
definitely
sad.
I don't think it's sad. I think sometimes it can be part of how we navigate the world, and if we stick out, we sometimes feel less confident. And
Mm,
to me, finding fashion is about finding confidence. If you wear something that you like, but you don't feel confident in it, then it's still not for you.
mhm,
Sometimes I wear clothes that I think, wow, they're so cool. And I'm like, but I don't feel like me. And
mhm,
I think that is what makes fashion so daunting because it's about finding who we are. And that's why I always say that looking to movie characters enables us, or book characters, or any kind of character that you find inspirational, can be so important because you're able to see why they come across the way they do. You
mhm,
know, maybe they seem quite shy, like, I've always felt so shy, and I don't think Audrey Hepburn comes across as, like, super confident, super extroverted, she's quite played down, and so I look at what makes her look played down, and it's the simple accessories, it's the small scale prints if she does wear prints. It's not wearing that many prints, it's wearing quite masculine silhouettes, it's certain things that make her look a certain way.
mhm.
And I think when you look at characters or maybe, movie stars or whoever in a certain way and kind of dissect why they present the way they do, it makes it easier to emulate. And from that place of emulation, you can then develop your own style that's unique and authentic to you.
Mhm. Yeah, and exactly what you're saying about like Audrey Hepburn, basically, like you can, she's not the most extroverted like person in the world, but she looks like confident, but also comfortable in herself with what she wears, and she can still make a statement without, like you saying, like wearing really like garish patterns or that sort of thing. And yeah, you kind of forget. I kind of forget how much like clothing and kind of style rely on the confidence of the wearer.
Yeah, I think that we often downplay how much our confidence can be changed by what we wear. My
Mhm.
mum dresses kind of like Moira Rose from Schitt's Creek, the super
Okay.
gothy, but also just out there, really amazing black and white patterns with splashes of red and large scale angular patterns and really chunky silver jewelry and things like that. And she's actually quite a shy person, but I think that when she dresses in a way that's like super alternative, it gives her confidence because she's able to step into who she feels deep down.
Mhm.
And I love that because she just seems like so herself when she wears these super wild things and, like, she just dresses however she wants, and she just looked amazing when she does it, and I think you see this change in her. It just comes over her. She seems to just drop into who she really is.
That's so cool. I love that your mum is also an absolute style icon as well.
Oh, thank you.
I'm just trying to like picture the combination of different colors and patterns, and it sounds really cool.
She is so cool. She loves vintage things as well. We went to a thrift store recently and we just got like some amazing stuff for like a fiver. It was incredible.
They're dangerous places.
They really are.
um, and I know you mentioned about going back a bit to color analysis. Like, I find that super interesting as someone who like studied graphic design and is a graphic designer. And I know that, like, obviously you're saying, some people don't kind of get on with it or relate to it, but I love the idea of kind of color like swatching for yourself for like your color.
Yeah.
I love that idea. And I know obviously it's one of your special interests. So
Mhm.
yeah, it'd be nice to hear of other special interests as well as talking more color.
I love reading and I also love studying nutrition. And the two can be combined. I have a million nutrition books. And that's been a special interest since I was about 16. I have to be careful with it because I do have that eating disorder past, but at the same time, even taking away that kind of element, you can find so much interesting stuff that's relating to nutrition. I think if I had the scientific capabilities, which I definitely don't, I'd probably become a dietitian. It's just fascinating to me.
Mhm.
And then I also love my dogs. They're like my special interest. I
Oh.
love them so much. I
So
love doing yoga and watching gratuitously violent TV.
I love how that went from so calm to so, like, the complete opposite.
I am nothing if not a person of contrast.
Amazing. And your dogs, Josephine and Moses, they're so cute. I'm a
Thank
real
you.
dog person.
I love dog people. Dog people are the best. I love both.
And they're just always, like, so happy to see you as well, which I appreciate.
Yeah, like they know when you need them as well. Like they know when you need extra comfort.
Mhm. Oh, yeah, exactly, and I kind of feel like they work as well. This sounds terrible, but as, like, a weighted lap pad.
Yes, they really do. Especially if you have huge dogs like mine. I mean, they think they're little dogs and they will climb on you and they don't realize that they weigh like 60 pounds.
Mhm. And they're all legs, really, aren't they?
They are. They sometimes when they lie in certain positions, they really look like they have like 8 legs each.
Amazing. They're so cute though, and, like, I feel like that's what I kind of enjoy about your Instagram as well, is that, like, you're not afraid to go into, deep dive into the heavier topics, but also, just showing, like, real moments of your life that you're cherishing and trying not to take things for granted. And I don't know, I like when people show a kind of whole sort of range and try and kind of share across the like board, like their lives, rather than just like, I find it quite difficult because as someone that just does illustrations on Instagram, like that's what people expect from me. Um,
Yeah.
Whereas I think maybe if I was to kind of branch out a little bit more, people might get to know me, kind of thing. Whereas I feel like I know you.
I love that. I love that you feel like you can know me from my Instagram because that's
Yeah.
all I've ever wanted is to be kind of relatable. I don't want to be like you sometimes see accounts that don't talk at all about who they are. And
Mm.
even if they create incredible content, I always want to know who's behind them. Like, I want to know you. I want to know who you are. I want to know what makes you tick. I want to know about your life. And that's probably just because I'm like super nosy and I just want the drama. But
Oh, I think everyone is to some extent. Like, you want to know the kind of person behind the account, sort of thing. But yeah, I think that really kind of comes across in your content, that you're just working out life as you go and just trying to be you.
well, thank you. I'm so glad that it comes across as like really authentic because I hate when sometimes I'll create something and I'll post it and I'll be having a really bad day, but it'll be something positive. I
Mhm.
hate doing it. It feels like I'm lying to my audience and it's like, I look terrible. I've just posted this photo shoot where I was all dressed up.
I kind of feel like that is Instagram though, in a way, is that like you never really know how the person feels when they're posting, but most of the time they've captured a great kind of moment, sort of thing, like in terms of, I don't know, the influences out there, sort of thing. But actually to have people showing the kind of, I know what you mean. If you're having a bad day and you're posting something positive, it does feel a bit like, oh.
Yeah, like disingenuous.
Yeah. But I think everyone does it. That's the thing. Like,
Yeah.
it's hard not to. And like, how do you kind of juggle the kind of content? Because I know you were saying like, oh, you make like kind of one or two reels about a certain thing each month, and I'm like, whoa, that's like, I kind of make a reel when I like really have to, kind of thing. Like,
Yeah.
do you kind of plan out stuff? Do you aim for things, or do you just kind of do what you feel like?
I aim to do at least 5 stories a day, which can just be any kind of random thing. But
Mhm.
then the thing that I aim for most is a quota of about 5 reels a week or 5 posts a week that aren't stories. So it might be like a carousel or it might be just a random picture. But I try to go heavy on the reels because that's what people want. That's what the algorithm seems to love. It just eats up the
Mm.
reels. And but if I could post anything I wanted, it would just be writing, because writing really is like the only thing I know how to do. I've always been a writer. I've been writing ever since I was about 2 or 3 years old. It's my only truly marketable skill and the only thing that makes me vaguely employable, which I'm not really. And as someone who's never been able to make a living from writing, I know that it's the ultimate profession of like a starving artist. It isn't glamorous like I imagined it would be when I was a child. So
Mhm.
creating other types of content enables me to kind of expand my audience and hopefully one day make a living from it. But eventually, I guess I want to use my content as a springboard to writing because for me, writing is very rewarding. I get to make shapes and patterns with language and transpose them into words that other people can read, to share things that I wouldn't otherwise be able to talk about, and to make them beautiful or at least tangible. I think that's it. It's about communicating in a way that feels entirely natural, which most communication doesn't. So, for
Mhm.
example, right now, I'm almost entirely reading from notes. All of my answers are basically scripted. As if I'm not, I just don't know what I'm saying.
Mhm. I'm with you. Don't worry. I mean, I'm reading from a podcast outline, and people probably don't. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this on my podcast, but I always send an outline, and likewise, guests sometimes script answers, which is absolutely fine and probably something I'd do.
I went on a podcast a few years ago where I had nothing scripted. It was all about being aromantic, which I no longer identify necessarily as aromantic, but it was also about asexuality and autism. And I didn't have any scripted answers. I was so unprepared. And I didn't know what I was saying the whole time. Unfortunately, it was edited in such a way that it sounded okay, but I was convinced it was going to be mostly me trying to figure out words to string together.
Mhm. See that? Yeah, that does sound terrifying.
Yeah.
We like to come prepared here.
Yeah.
I get that. I definitely agree. And kind of like, what would be your like in terms of writing? Like, would you like to write like a novel and have it published? Like, do you see a kind of like end sort of goal or anything, or is it just to kind of write for the love of writing?
I've had an outline of my desired career since I was about 5.
Hmm.
So, it didn't work out the way I wanted it to. I wrote a novella when I was 16, and it was edited by a doctor of philosophy,
Oh wow.
and it looked very promising. I spoke with some agents. It was definitely heading in the right direction towards publication. But then all the drama kicked off with my dad, and I ended up having to abandon it. And I have never picked that particular piece of work up again. But hopefully one day that could get published. But my goal for now, knowing what the market is like and knowing what the world of literature has become, I think I'd like to first off write a book about my experiences as an autistic person with trauma. I'm writing that currently. This is the first time I'm talking about that publicly, actually.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's very exciting. A lot of people have asked for a book for a long time, and I'm really excited to write one, and hopefully that will be published probably not next year, but maybe the year after. And then eventually, once I've had work published and I hopefully can make something for myself in terms of an audience and in terms of publishing, I would like to start writing fiction again. I have always been a fiction writer primarily, and I guess I turned to nonfiction as a way to make money. It's like
Mhm.
you can't make money off fiction unless you've already, I think, got something of an audience.
Okay.
Um, I mean, yeah, I guess you can, but it's like 1 in a million. It's like you'd probably win the lottery more easily.
Yeah.
It's a tough market. Um, but publishing nonfiction, I think, is more doable for me right now. But eventually, I'd love a career as a fiction author, something like novels and short stories, and yeah, all that stuff is my jam.
Hmm. I'd love to, honestly, I would love to read your book because even the way that you talk via your content and also via this podcast, like the way you describe things is so clear, but also you manage to go into so much detail without losing the clarity, which I think is quite a like feat of being able to put things so like succinctly is a huge skill. And I'd love to. I just love reading like memoirs and biographies and things like I love I love people's stories, people's own stories. That's probably why I have a podcast, I think.
Oh, thank you so much. That's such a wonderful compliment. I always feel like I'm just going off on a tangent and people are just lost. And it's so nice to know that you're not because
No,
I worry
no.
that I just go on, I just ramble.
No, not at all. And also, if there's anywhere to ramble, it's a podcast. So,
Yes.
so yeah, I can't believe how long we've been talking for. I say this at the end of every podcast because they seem to go so quick. But where can people find you online on the internet? Where can people follow you? Anything else you'd like to promote?
Well, I'm at Pixie's Big Y on Instagram. I'm not on anything else currently, but I there are a few TikToks floating around under the same name, but I'm barely on there because I just get addicted to it.
Yeah, I
But
get
yeah,
you.
yeah. So it's mostly just on Instagram, but hopefully soon you'll be able to find me other places when I expand my content. I'd like to start YouTube at some point, and that will
Ooh.
all be under Pixie's Big Y. There's no way I can cope with more than one username.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. If you can keep them all the same, makes things
Yeah.
easier. Oh, YouTube will be exciting though, like longer form kind of potentially.
Yeah, I'd like to do vlogs because people seem to really enjoy them,
Mm,
and, I'd also like to just talk about different things that people are curious about that I find myself having to shave down for, like, the 3-minute limit on Instagram, and
yeah.
it's so irritating.
Yeah, I think people don't realize that. Like, I feel like I know you, but I've just seen multiple 3-minute, tops kind of videos,
Yeah.
which is great. But I kind of feel like a longer form stuff, like you really do get to kind of understand like people's day and kind of routine and stuff. So that's
Yeah.
exciting.
Oh, thank you. I'm super excited too.
Well, thank you so much for being up for coming on and battling through many technical things.
Thank you for having me. It really is an honor.